I didn't really need to make a title slide for this because I had a title image, which was actually the first issue of the NSS News that I edited as the new editor back in August of '96. So this issue, it's available online, but it covers not only the dives I'm going to talk about, but I also got a write up from Peter Bolt about his dive for this issue. So it's all in this issue. Uh, a more recent development was that the Park Service came out with a book about diving in the national park. And I was pleased to see that they covered our dives in Lechuguilla. And it was no accident because they'd been in communication with me. And so I gave them some photos for it, actually. But you can get this publication online for free. So just a map showing the two areas where I'm going to be talking about. The Near East is the location for two of the dives, Lake of the Blue Giants and Stud Lake. And then in the Southwest Passage is where Castrovalva is located, not far from the Chandelier Ballroom. So just a few intro shots. Of course, Lechuguilla is named for all these plants on the surface, and this is pretty much what it looks like. Uh, so first of all, I'm going to be talking about um, Lake of the Blue Giants. Lake of the Blue Giants was found on an expedition in 1988. Uh, to get down to the Near East involved the dreaded Apricot Pit, which is about 400 feet of rift. But the Near East is, at the time, it was, I believe, one of the better decorated areas found in the cave. Lots of aragonite, lots of small pools. It contained the longest soda straw known at the time in the cave, something like 8 feet long. Another shot of it. So this is all the area that we would be traveling through to get to Lake of the Blue Giants. This is actually the Emperor's Chamber, and on the left here, this is actually the what is called the Emperor of Lechuguilla. I think someone had a shot earlier of another formation, but this is, as far as I know, what we call the Emperor. Uh, Lots of decoration in the Near East, lots of draperies, some pretty stunning examples of air corrosion in this area. Small pools, pools with light in them, aragonite. This is the Great Beyond, as it's called. Lots of this in the Near East and, of course, all over the cave. You get some curious areas down in the lower parts of the Near East with this pothole-like erosion. And normally you'd associate this with stream passage, but in this case, I think it's more just acidic erosion. This is the rusticles, and this was the base camp for stuff in this part of the cave once you were allowed to officially camp. And these formations are a very weird amalgam of iron and calcite. One of the last features on the way to the Blue Giants area is this so-called orange bowl. So I want to thank Rod Horrocks for loaning me this map to use of this portion of the cave. Uh, in 1988, when I was on a survey team, we entered this large room, and I was the first to spot this lake, and it looked pretty curious. So I I called, said, everyone, you got to stop the survey, and we all came over the edge, and we shone our lights down in it. And at first, it just looked like, oh, it's an awesome shelfstone lake. I think at the time it was probably one of the biggest lakes known in the cave, ringed with shelfstone. But when we shone our lights down in it, there was something curious, and we couldn't quite get a handle on it, but there appeared to be giant stalagmites under the water. And at the time, there were no trails or anything, but we kept the edges clean by, in those days, we would sometimes just have bare feet. Aqua socks became more of a standard a few years later. Just some light under the water, so this entire picture is lit by water, light transmitting through the water. But trying to light this stuff up underneath is difficult because the water is always kind of moving from drips on it. This was a shot Norm Thompson sent me that showed them a little bit better. So after the 1988 discovery, I came back a few months later, and I had a dive mask and a dive light. And this was back in the wild, wild west of the LCP expeditions. It was no trouble having permission to do an exploratory dive. So I jumped in, went 10 feet under the water with my light, and was able to see that, sure enough, there seems to be a passage going off this thing. So I applied to the park for a permit, and in 1989, a crew of, I think there were about 5 of us, Peter Bosted and was along, and Juna Bewley, and a few other people. And we hauled enough gear down for me to do a solo dive in Blue Giant. So what I used was, I had a single pony bottle. Actually, this is like a 40 cubic foot tank, and it's got a slingshot valve on it so that you do have some redundancy with 2 regulators. And I had a really nice light and a proper dive line, all that good dive stuff. So what did I find? On this dive, I was able to go down, drop down, and I dropped into a tunnel that was, I would describe it as the belly of a whale, because it was like a throat that I followed down. It was completely lined with white mammallaries, and it just kept going down at a 45-degree angle. This is a shot from, in fact, all my shots now are from a year later when National Geographic came to the cave to shoot, and they wanted to duplicate on film my dive here. So this was a shot we made during that shoot, and you can see the stalagmites. So on the National Geographic shoot, I borrowed the camera that Nick Nichols had, underwater camera, and it was all set up with underwater lights. I shot a bunch of these underwater stalagmites. So now all these are shots taken underwater. The deepest the stalagmites extended was about 30 feet of depth. And using my dive compression, or depth gauge rather, I was able to measure the heights of some of them. The tallest was 12 feet high. So there's several dozen of them down here. And one thing that's interesting to spot it underneath here, everything is covered with mammallaries, but you can see on the left side here, if you can see my cursor, these are all former levels of the pool. This is shelf stone that's all now been inundated and covered with mammillary. So the Lake of the Blue Giants had at least five or more different stands where it stayed at one level for quite some time. There you can see those levels more clearly. And the cave was even open to air long enough that formations broke off and fell and were re-cemented by the mammillaries that were encoding everything. So on this first dive, it lasted only about 20 minutes until I got down to a depth of 70 feet or so. I could see though that it was probably another 20 feet to the bottom, but I was having trouble clearing my ears, so I didn't go all the way, but it opened up into a fairly large room. Here's my little Jiffy map. My survey as such is just based on how much dive line I reeled out. I would make, on these dives, I would tie a little knot in the dive line so I could at least measure how much I had spooled out. But I got down to about this point, and I could see that it opened up into quite a much larger room, but it was pretty easy to see that there was no leads, no hope of continuation, because everything was completely lined with these white mammillary. So sketching it in on Rod's map here, here's how I figure that the extension I made in Lake of the Blue Giants would look on his map. And so it would be nice if it was added to the map, but with the caveat that, you know, this isn't a perfect survey, and, you know, it could be off by a bit. I doubt anyone's going to go back to check it though. So I mentioned that in 1990, we had a National Geographic Society trip there, and as part of the recreation of the Blue Giants dive, I said, well, how about if when you carry all that gear down, I do a dive in this other lake called Stud Lake. As you saw on the previous map, that's not far away from Blue Giants and was actually discovered on the same day. So I had much fancier equipment for this dive because we had lots of Sherpas for the National Geographic endeavor. And in fact, I even had a full-on 80 cubic inch tank or cubic foot tank, thanks to people like Rocco Stemble that carried this stuff down Apricot Pit. So when Stud Lake, the air-filled portion goes back about 100 feet and hits a wall. And the same day I had done my little scouting of Blue Giants the year before, I had also gone to Stud Lake and dropped down. And I could see again that there was passage continuing. And so this is now, I'm 100 feet out into the lake and I'm dropping down. And what do I see but all these bizarre underwater helictites. And these particular ones, to me, are quite different than any of the others I've seen in Lech, or for that matter, that I've seen images of from anywhere else. And one thing that struck me was that all of them seem to be oriented in the same direction. So in my mind, what that meant was that this lake obviously had been open at one time. Because a lot of these are all perched lakes, and they've had periods when they were dry. So I could imagine that there might have been air current moving through here that made these orient the way they are. So of course, I had visions that this was going to go and go because surely if there was air moving through here, there was a lot of passage beyond. So again, these I shot with National Geographic's camera after I did the dive. But so I don't really have any pictures of the dive, but basically back on the right here is where it opens into the main cave. I dropped down about 100 feet in, and then all along the floor in this passage were these large stalagmites that are all, I'd say they were all raft cones, but they were very broad based compared to the ones I'm used to. And everything beneath the waterline is covered in orange mammalian. So I went about 100 feet and I looked up and I saw formations dipping into the water above me. And I thought, well, this looks suspicious. So I came up and I popped into a little room. I later named the isolation chamber, but it was an air-filled room. I took my regulator out of my mouth and took some breaths, and it seemed to be viable air. For all I know, I was breathing air that was hundreds of years old, if not thousands of years old. And then it occurred to me, maybe this isn't a good air to breathe. So I popped the regulator back in and continued on, and it opened up into a much larger room beyond. It took me a while to poke through all the periphery of it, but I satisfied myself that there was no continuation. So this one, based on the dive line I reeled out, is a much longer piece of cave. And this is my projection onto Rod's map. So I'd say it's significantly increased the footprint of this area. But again, this is just based on how much dive line did I reel out. So then the third set of dives didn't occur until 1995. And by this time, there was new superintendent, new rules. And for this trip to dive the lakes of Castrovalva, it was required that I have a dive buddy. So I recruited my good friend Ron Simmons, who is a much more experienced cave diver than I. And we put together a team of 11 people, about half of them from the Virginia region and half from California. So just a trip down the Southwest Passage. This is Lake Chandelar, and dropping down into the LaBarge borehole here. So of course, all this gear had to be ferried down there. Crossing Lake LaBarge, the so-called Yellow Brick Road. As far as I know, no one has dove this lake. And now keep in mind that these are being done as day trips. So we're not carrying dive gear and camp gear, fortunately. So heading towards Castrovalva, it's not far from the Chandelier Maze and the Chandelier Ballroom. So a couple of shots of those. You saw this a little earlier. This is in the Chandelier Maze. And then part of the actual route to the dive is to go through the Chandelier Ballroom. This is the climb up into it. And we've all seen lots of pictures of the ballroom, but I was actually lucky enough to be on the first real photo shoot in there. But these are taken on a few different trips. I always liked using Pat for scale because she's the shortest caver that was on the project. And a lot of people just often look at this main group of chandeliers, but there's actually quite a variety to what's in that room. Okay, well, this is part of the actual crew that was carrying the gear for the Castrovalva dive. That's Viv Lofton in the lead there. So the Lake Castrovalva area, and this thanks to Hazel Barton for providing this nice detailed portion of the map. But we started down at the lower end here at what looks like a small lake, and at the time was known as Lake Margaret. And typically you would climb over sort of a shelf stone, what appeared to be a shelf stone bridge, and drop into Lake Castrovalva through a little drop off on the other side. One thing we did establish in our dive is that Margaret down here on the south and Castrovalva are the same lake. It's just a short bridge underneath here that connects the two. However, the main Castrovalva lake does not connect to these lakes further on into the inner chamber. So as I said, we had two of us diving, so lots of gear to bring down. I dove with the same bunch of swap meet purchased gear that I had at Lake of the Blue Giants. Quite a contrast to Ron's professional looking gear. I should add that all these pictures of Ron and I getting ready in the water were taken by Bonnie Crystal, who came along with the dive. So Ron was so decked out for this. It didn't really prove to be necessary to have so much gear as it turned out, because this lake really didn't go very far. We found a bunch of alcoves underneath, and at one point Ron squeezed through a little opening, got into a room that was maybe all of 5 or 6 feet long. But again, everything underneath is covered with these mammillary crusts, all orange. And so now that we're underwater, you'll see some shots with Ron in them that I shot, and the shots with me in them were taken by Ron. So we had, because the dive didn't go on very long, we had lots of time to take pictures. But what's kind of cool is the way these bulbous mammillaries coatings stuck down into the water. And this is actually the floor that we crossed over that connects.
5 minutes, Dave?
5 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, that's perfect. This is the floor that we crossed over. And then the main thing we saw down in there that was of note were these mammillary coated stalactites, or excuse me, mites. Somewhat different than the ones in Blue Giants. You can see the coatings on them are much finer, rather than the large bulbous mammillaries that we saw in Blue Giants. But there were quite a few of them. If we'd made a proper map, we could have put them all in their right orientation. But there were at least maybe 6 of the large ones here. And then just at the end here, just a few shots from what it looks like beyond. This is the far edge of Lake Castrovalva, and it leads into what is my favorite area of any cave on Earth. Lots of horseshoe rimstone. which you don't really see that much of in other parts of the cave that I recall. The amazing shelf stone cutouts. And I was trying to ask a question of Paul because from what I can see now, all this area that had been covered in water on top of the shelf stone is now dry. So there's been a big change in this room. This was proper attire for exploration there in the past. When well before the raft, you had to swim into the room. And as my parting shot, the huge shelf stone at the end of the room. I think this is still on the wall in the Horse Cave Museum. And that's it.
Thanks, Dave.